So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So feel free to turn your camera off if you want, if you have it showing. My name is Kimberly Kaler. I'm president of AOE, and AOE is a fully owned subsidiary of ACI. And we are the for-profit consulting division. We do everything from association management and marketing consulting. And we're real proud of the fact that we support ACI and your mission of delivering, the things that you do and all the great work. So really happy to be the premier sponsor of the conference. So today we're going to talk about crisis communications, and I already had some questions from the audience as this relate to the pandemic, and obviously to a certain extent it does. But being in the design and construction industry, having a good crisis plan is really key. I've unfortunately handled job site fatalities, chemical spills. There's a huge uptick right now of cyber crime as well. So really good to make sure that you look at your crisis plan as we move through things. So this is a summary slide in terms of what we're going to talk about today. So these are the key lessons learned. I'm happy to share my slides afterwards. We will have a video recording of this as well. So being transparent is something I'm going to talk quite a bit about. Communicating early and often is something I wish I had $1 for every time I've said in the last year. And then compassion and leadership. There's a huge role of empathy and compassion and connecting with your employees, your audiences, your students, your members with regard to crisis communications. So where are we now? And again, I'm going to take this from the vantage point right now with regard to the pandemic. So many organizations last March did not have a crisis plan. They'll say many construction firms may have a plan related to a job site accident, but it typically is more in accordance with OSHA in the United States, or obviously other regulating bodies around the world. So most organizations had to build their crisis efforts on the fly. But that unfortunately is not a plan. And even though most have done a really admirable job, there's a lot of decision fatigue that happens from that. If you're constantly going back and figuring out, what do we do next? What do we communicate next? So would invite you, if you're listening to this session today, to look back in the last year in terms of how you've communicated with regards to the pandemic, or maybe other things that have popped up. And look if you've really operated from a plan, or if you've operated out of habit, dragging everybody back to that virtual conference room in terms of moving forward with assembling what you need to do and what the next steps are. So these are the typical steps you would want to go through in terms of a crisis: preparing, the crisis breaks, the initial response, the assess response impact, resolution, evaluate, and evolve. And unfortunately, most of us in this last year, because we're operating without a plan, we continue just to go to crisis breaks, create the response, maybe get to resolution, but we don't do the evaluate and evolve. We don't do the prep. We just kind of, oscillate between 3 of the blocks here and are not fully operating in a good way from a decision standpoint. Good news here is there's still time to actually develop the plan and its key components. We're not through the pandemic yet. And I invite you, even though I'm making so many pandemic references, to look at this holistically for your organization in terms of what else may impact you from a crisis standpoint. So crisis is typically defined as something that is sudden and an unexpected disruption that will interrupt your normal operations, could impact your brand in terms of brand awareness, and in terms of what your key audiences think of in terms of your brand. It may involve other stakeholders, identifying agencies, etc. So this list here is typical crisis 101 areas to get started in terms of what may be potential. So in terms of your brainstorming session when you start your planning. And I have not updated this list, and I wanted to point out that in the 15 years or so that I've been training organizations related to crisis communications, we never talked about a pandemic. We never talked about social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And those are some of the big key issues, obviously, we've had to face during the last year. So really looking at what could impact our business, what could impact our association, what could impact our university, for those of you in the academic setting. Stages of crisis communications, and moving back again to that pre-crisis where you're monitoring risks. And last year, so many of us were immediately thrown. We weren't able to monitor. We immediately had to address the risk. Training people is a key component with regard to a crisis communications plan. So they're trained and you don't have to train on the fly or react on the fly. During the crisis, you're able to collect information and then implement the plan. And then post-crisis, you're able to take a step back and look what's worked, what hasn't. I hope some of you on this session today have taken a chance to look at the last year in your communication, but my guess is, and from talking to so many in the industry, you're so exhausted from the pandemic and just trying to keep business operations going, and you haven't necessarily taken the time to look at, hey, what's worked, what hasn't. So if we were developing a plan not in the time of crisis, and this is what I would invite you to do now, and again, I'm happy to send these slides off to you, is to start with that kickoff meeting, brainstorm, what would a crisis be, and look through that. Identifying who the crisis team is. This you've probably done on the fly in the last year and probably brought in a broad-based group of people from your organization. But what I have noticed is even though the teams that have been assembled to respond to the crises and the pandemic tend to be broad and have all sorts of different functions within an organization represented, the roles aren't necessarily defined. So one of the things and benefits of pre-planning is you can identify this is how, or this is the person or the team that will be developing the messages, and here's the decision tree in terms of who reviews it. Chances are you're actually continuing to have that discussion each time. You create that action plan, and then educating employees is really key too, to make sure that the employees understand what the plan is and how it works. I'll share a quick story of a crisis we were helping a client through. It was a job site accident. They did a great job in terms of getting everybody into, that physical conference room. It was obviously pre-pandemic, and, implementing the plan that they had in place, but they forgot to let the woman that answered the phones at the front desk know what was going on. And she started to feel called from reporters, and innocently enough, she's like, I don't know, so much is going on here, etc. And it really made the team have to take a left turn in terms of their response, because they forgot just to engage their employees and educate them. So questions to consider regarding internal logistics. What are the procedures for crisis meetings? Who needs to be briefed? Who needs permission to get things done or not? Again, that goes back to who's going to write the messages, who's releasing things, who needs to review things. How do we contact crisis team members? This is really key too. One of the old tenets of Crisis Communications 101 planning was to make sure you had a copy of the plan outside of the office. What if the office burned down? And now obviously we're so much more virtual and working off cloud servers, but that happened. So really making sure that everybody is key in terms of all those decision trees. So even though I've been doing crisis communications for a long time, one of the things that I really learned last year and gained a greater appreciation for is that one size does not fit all. We helped about 30 organizations put together their response during the pandemic, to clients, to members, because we work with both associations and companies, engineers, architects, contractors. And it was across the board, though we found some similarities, it was really, really key to have a very customized approach. In the past, things were a lot more cookie cutter and more standard and templated. Another lesson learned is that now is not the time to change your corporate culture. So we had a few clients that use this as an opportunity of, hey, we've really wanted to try and get this new message out, and now's not the time. In order to have that transparency with your target audiences, you need to respond in a way that actually fits your culture. So as you're assembling that team, you need to make sure that you've assembled a team that is empowered to take effective action in a crisis, You make sure you have both the communications end of things as well as operational, and making sure that there's a good flow of information between staff and between management. So listing again of different potential folks that you may pull into your team. I get this question a lot. Should we have our legal counsel on your team? My immediate recommendation, without knowing more, is probably not necessary to be at every meeting, but it would be good to make sure that they're aware of your plan and that you know how to get legal counsel quickly involved should you need to if a crisis happens. So when choosing a spokesperson for the company, again, this needs to fit your culture. Who is the official voice for the company, the association, the organization? That person should be good with the media, be good with, and trained in terms of how to communicate any key messages. And it may not necessarily be your top official. And many organizations have learned this. And if you look to politics, and I'm not going to comment on politics one way or another here, but some really good examples in terms of, maybe you have a VP in some cases that it has the authority and the clout to actually speak with the media or with different stakeholders. And that person talks a lot about the nitty-gritty of the organization or the plan or whatever is happening, the crises at hand. And you can always bring in the higher up, the CEO, the executive director, the highest executive of the company for more of that compassionate piece. So it allows you to separate a little bit. And I'll share, we have Ron Berg on the line here from ACI, and there was a dual approach in terms of all communications we had with employees. Our HR director handled a lot of the nitty-gritty operational details. There's so much to coordinate, as you know, during a pandemic, for example. And Ron really showed compassion and was communicating, and still is on a weekly basis with employees, more of that communication, the human side of things. So look at what the roles are in the communication and make sure it's a natural fit too, in terms of fitting your culture. So making sure everyone in the company is familiar with the value, the mission statement, the big why is really key here. Considering who will craft the messages is also really important. I've touched on that a little bit here, but you don't want to have to recreate the wheel if a crisis happens in terms of who's in charge, where the message, considering the assets that need to be created, having key messages already outlined, and when we've been putting crisis plans together for construction companies, especially, those key messages, already having it written out with related to safety, knowing what your safety record is, all that kind of data and information, having it ready to go really helps, because you can plug and play if something happens. And then having some sort of monitoring in place, especially related to social media. So if things are happening, you don't want to, get a phone call with regards to, hey, have you been watching social media? You see what's being said about you here, so being real important to already have those monitoring tools in place. So being transparent, this is a real tough one because you don't have all of the answers. None of us do related to the pandemic, but that applies to a job site accident. Maybe there's a product failure, all sorts of other situations. So be very transparent in terms of what you do know, what you don't know. And in some cases, you may not be able to comment on something. Maybe there is an OSHA investigation, that kind of thing. So let folks know what you know and what you don't know. Centralize all of your information. And then this last note here, in most cases, do not delete. This really applies to social media. Another big threat with regard to crisis communications right now is social media. We have a lot of clients that have had challenges with former employees that get on their social media, their Facebook account, and badmouth the company. And in most cases, it's good to actually not delete those and maybe redirect them. The exceptions to that would be you would never want anything vulgar, defamatory, anything against race, sexism, etc. But Deleting can lead to a lot of mistrust. Real key that you have a social media policy as well. So how do you communicate in a crisis? Best way is through your existing channels. Email probably for most of you, especially if most of your communication and target is going to employees, maybe it's going to members, maybe it's going to vendors and other partners in your design builder relationship. What you communicate in addition to your key messages, it's real important to make sure you look at what's already loaded. So one of the first things that we did last March is look at social media that we already had scheduled for clients. You know, the email blast that we had already targeted, ready to go in May that was loaded, had to look at it to see if it was still appropriate. Is it still make sense? If you recall back to last March when the pandemic was getting crazy, people were being sent home, and you were still getting emails from Target or Kohl's or Depart Nordstrom saying, buy your summer sandals and buy your new swimsuit for the summer. It seemed very inappropriate. So make sure that whatever you have loaded and is ready to go still fits in terms of you know, your communication. And then establish expectations, especially when dealing with the media, but this applies to employees as well. Tell them when and how often you are going to communicate. And we saw a lot of great examples of that. Again, I won't comment on politics, you know, supporting one politician or another, but most states had a daily update. I spent a lot of my career in Ohio, and Governor DeWine, everybody knew he came on at 2 o'clock every day. It was called Wine with DeWine time. That was kind of just became the you know, vernacular in the state. So really telling people what they can expect in terms of expectations. With regards to prepared statements, you know, we all have learned the importance of not saying no comment, or I don't have that, you know, it's okay to say I don't have that answer, but having some of these prepackaged statements ready to go. This one shown on the screen here especially applies to a job site accident. And this is really hard to roll off the tongue or create when you're in a crisis situation, but if you've got it ready to go, I think it's really, really key, and you can plug in the appropriate information. Being careful not to speculate, you know, source the facts. We all knew that, you know, last year, especially according to the CDC, with a, you know, a job site accident, you'd want to be very clear in terms of what you can talk about or not, especially with regards to your other partners on the project, any sort of investigation from a health and safety welfare standpoint as well. If you don't know, say you don't know. Human nature is for us to start to ramble. Say, I don't know, but I'd be happy to speak with, you know, the team members that know a little bit more about that. Or maybe I need to speak with technology, or I need to speak with, you know, our financial team, and I'd be happy to follow back up with you. And then understanding OSHA, or whatever the equivalent of OSHA is, wherever you are listening to this from, insurance, HIPAA, ADA regulations, being really careful about knowing what you can release. So while I'm telling you to be transparent and share information, be real careful about what, and you know what you're allowed to share and not share. Communication should be really clear too. Most of us on this session today have a technical role or maybe a technical background. And this is a really silly example now because we all know what social distancing means. But in the beginning last March, it was very fuzzy. It was not clear. So practice social distancing. What does that mean? You know, stay home, be very clear, 6 feet apart. So making sure that you tone down any technical references as well so your audience understands. Highlight once again the importance of saturating your employees and other stakeholders with the information. Make sure that everybody is getting all those same key messages and help them understand what they know and what they don't know. Again, another example, I'll go through this quickly, but you know, great example for you to have in terms of sharing information that you can plug and play real quick with you know, any type of situation that you may have. So with that, I'm going to try and sum it up for you, and then we'll open it up to questions. I want to stress again the importance of being transparent, acknowledging that you're a time of crisis, real key to show that, you know, that empathy piece of it when you're in a crisis, not only the facts and the details, but also the human side of it. Communicating early and often. You will not have all the answers. You know, so don't wait. Oh, we can't send the email to employees yet. We can't talk to the media yet. We don't know all the answers. You're not going to know all the answers. So, you know, find the right time in which you have enough that you can actually share. Ask yourself constantly, what does each audience need to know? It's not a one size fits all. And then compassion and leadership. Let people know that you are caring for your people. We saw a lot of really great examples of that in this last year in the pandemic. I've seen many organizations that have actually done a better job communicating with their employees or their members than maybe they had in the past. And I hope that's something that continues. And then again, don't forget to communicate with your employees. You may be doing a great job at communicating with your vendors or your other design partners, you know, maybe your students if you're on the call from a university, but making sure that you're also communicating with your team members is really key too. So those are our social handles. I invite you to follow them there. And then I will go ahead and open this up for any questions. You're welcome to use the chat feature, if I can see where the chat feature is. And if not, I'm happy to have you just go ahead and unmute yourself for any questions that you may have. Okay. How often should we communicate during an ongoing and long-term crisis? Great question. Thank you for that. The answer to that is really dependent on the crisis. But if it's a big crisis, it's a job site fatality, it's something like that, you'd probably want to do it every 24 hours, at least in those initial stages. With regard to, you know, things with the pandemic, you know, communicating with your employees maybe on a weekly or every other week basis is really key. I've heard from a lot of people that the communication was really great with their employees in the beginning, and then it's really cut themselves off. But whatever it is, make sure that it's regular. You don't want to start something and then have folks begin to depend on it and not, you know, not bring it back up again. Any other questions coming through for the group? And again, I invite you to unmute yourself and come on the camera or come through the chat room if you'd like. Okay. Well, I wanted to share real quickly, we have a couple of other demos scheduled for this week. Again, we're trying to bring some business topics to the convention. I'm going to be talking later today about strategic planning in a virtual world. Tomorrow we're talking about news, and that's actually at 11:15. Tomorrow we have Amy Numbers of my team is going to talk about e-newsletters and e-blasts and how to get the most out of those in terms of getting your audience to read them. We're also going to talk a little bit about podcasts, something that we have just started and got into from an AOE perspective. And then on Wednesday, we're going to talk about all things social media. So the top 7 tips with regards to social media and things you need to look at with your social media platforms. So with that, I will wish you all a great morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are dialing in from. And thank you for joining today. We will follow up with everybody with a copy of this, so you'll have it. And if you want to reach out to me directly, I'm happy to send you the slides as well. So thank you very much.